Every empire has had its hidden pressure point, a narrow pass, a mountain gap, a port, a river mouth, where the flow of power could be halted with a single move. In the 21st century, that point is a strip of water so tight it could disappear from a map under your thumb. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest, a corridor through which nearly 20% of the world's oil must pass every single day. And here's what nobody tells you: the global economy you rely on, the price you pay at the pump, the stability of nations oceans away, all of it balances on this fragile maritime artery. Here's why this matters. When a choke point holds this much energy, it becomes more than geography. It becomes leverage. And the country sitting at its edge understands exactly what that leverage is worth. This is where the pattern begins. The modern world runs on oil. Yet, unlike other commodities, oil relies not just on production, but on transportation, on tankers that must squeeze through narrow waters patrolled by rival navies. To understand why the Strait of Hormuz became the world's most strategic transit zone, you have to rewind to 1908, when the first major Middle Eastern oil discovery was struck in Persia. The find triggered a seismic shift in global power. By the 1970s, as the Middle East became the primary engine of global oil supply, the strait, wedged between Iran and Oman, transformed into the world's indispensable gateway. At first, it looked like a miracle, a tiny region becoming the energy heart of the planet. Then the bill arrived. Here's what nobody tells you. Choke points are more powerful than resources. Resources can be found in many places. Choke points cannot. And the Strait of Hormuz is the tightest link in the entire global energy chain. In the 1980s, this truth became violently clear during the Iran-Iraq War. Tankers were attacked, waters mined, shipping lanes threatened. Insurance costs shot up. Naval escorts were deployed. During the so-called tanker war, over 400 vessels were damaged or destroyed. Oil prices spiked. Global anxiety surged. Everyone thought they were safe. They weren't. The danger wasn't what they saw, it was what they ignored. The realization that a few hostile actions in a narrow channel could destabilize economies continents away. Even after the war, the strait's vulnerability never disappeared. Instead, it evolved into a geopolitical pressure valve. Whenever tensions rose between Iran and Western nations, over sanctions, nuclear negotiations, or regional conflicts, statements from Iranian officials hinted at the same possibility. The strait could be closed. Not permanently. Strategically. Analysts suggest these comments were rarely literal threats and more often leverage tactics, reminders that Iran sits beside the world's energy jugular vein. And in a global system that depends heavily on perception, the hint of closure can be as destabilizing as closure itself. Why does this narrow passage hold such influence? Geography. Pure, unavoidable geography. At its tightest point, the strait shrinks to a maritime corridor where inbound and outbound tanker lanes lie only a few miles apart. These tankers carry oil from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar, producers whose economies rely on exports and whose customers span the globe. Japan, South Korea, India, and China are particularly dependent on the steady flow through Hormuz. Here's why this matters. A disruption here affects not a region, but a planet. But early cracks in the global system began appearing long before the 21st century's geopolitical tensions. In 1973, during the Arab oil embargo, the world saw how supply constraints could reshape economies. In 1979, during the Iranian Revolution, global oil markets convulsed again. Each crisis was unique, but the underlying message repeated. Energy choke points magnify every instability. They convert regional disputes into global consequences. Not local, planetary. By the 2000s, as Iran's nuclear program became a central point of global negotiation, the Strait of Hormuz resurfaced as a pressure tool. Iranian officials occasionally warned that if sanctions intensified, they could restrict passage. Analysts emphasize that these statements were couched in strategic ambiguity, not explicit operational intent. Yet markets reacted every time. Oil prices rose, shipping firms recalculated risk, Navy fleets repositioned. The psychological power of the strait echoed louder than any military maneuver. And here's the mechanism. Global oil markets are built on confidence. Prices reflect not only supply and demand, but the belief that supply will continue unhindered. When that belief wavers, markets don't wait for disruption. They anticipate it. Futures traders price in risk. Refineries scramble for alternatives. Import-dependent nations draw up emergency plans. And even if the strait never closes, the world behaves as if closure is imminent. A threat becomes a reality through economic reaction. The geography reinforces this vulnerability. Tankers navigating the strait must follow carefully charted traffic lanes to avoid collisions, reefs, and shallow waters. A mined area, a blocked lane, or even a damaged vessel could force temporary stoppages. During past standoffs, U.S. and allied navies have conducted escort missions to ensure safe passage. But here's what nobody tells you. Even with naval protection, the strait is not immune to disruption. A single incident, accidental or intentional, can trigger days of paralysis. And in energy markets measured by hours, not days, that paralysis becomes a global event. The paradox is striking. The world's most vital energy corridor is also its most fragile, and fragility invites leverage. Iran, positioned along the northern boundary, maintains military bases, missile sites, and maritime forces that can project influence into the waterway. According to some analysts, Iran's strategy relies less on actually closing the strait and more on demonstrating that it could impose significant delays or hazards if strategically motivated. Not closure. Leverage. Meanwhile, Gulf states on the southern shores have invested in alternatives, pipelines bypassing the strait, storage facilities farther west, security partnerships with global naval powers. Yet, those alternatives, while helpful, can only reroute a fraction of the total flow. Most exports remain locked into the geometry of Hormuz. Geography does not negotiate. Through the decades, incidents accumulated like warnings. In 2011, tensions flared as Iranian officials again referenced possible closure in response to sanctions. In 2019, tankers were attacked near Fujairah, just outside the strait, sparking international alarm. Naval standoffs became more frequent, each one testing the limits of deterrence and restraint. These events were not isolated. They formed a pattern, each moment revealing how quickly the calm surface of the strait can shift into a strategic battlefield. Yet, beneath all these episodes lies a deeper truth, one rarely acknowledged openly. Choke points are mirrors. They expose the interconnectedness of global trade and the imbalance of vulnerability among nations. Importers fear disruption. Exporters fear blockade. Nearby states fear escalation. And global powers fear losing influence over the arteries that keep their economies functioning. Let me show you exactly how this imbalance shapes strategy. A wealthy nation may have advanced military capabilities, but it cannot operate without fuel. A rising economy may expand its manufacturing power, but it cannot export without stable shipping lanes. A superpower may project influence across oceans, but it cannot control a choke point without constant presence. Not strength, exposure. As energy consumption rose through the 2010s, so did the fragility of this corridor. China, India, and other Asian economies grew increasingly dependent on Middle Eastern oil. Europe continued to rely on regional supplies. The United States reduced direct dependence due to domestic production, but maintained strategic interest to preserve global stability. Every major power had something at stake, and that made the Strait of Hormuz not just a choke point, but a fulcrum of global diplomacy. But here's what nobody tells you. The true test is not whether the strait closes, but whether the world can endure the shockwave triggered by the mere perception of closure. Tanker rerouting, insurance cost spikes, naval mobilization, futures market panic. These processes begin long before any physical barrier appears in the water. The world reacts to the signal, not the act. And now we arrive at the cliffhanger, the question that drives the second half of this documentary. If 20% of the world's oil depends on a narrow strip of water controlled at its edge by a nation with deep geopolitical grievances and powerful strategic incentives, what happens when the threat of closure becomes more than rhetoric? The answer is not simple, not predictable, but the consequences reach every corner of the global economy. every energy-consuming household, every nation with a stake in stability. That is the world we enter next. Here's what nobody tells you. The modern global economy is not built on oil itself, but on the assumption that oil will continue moving without interruption. Once that assumption breaks, everything else begins to fracture with it. And here's why this matters. A closure, or even partial disruption, of the Strait of Hormuz is not just a regional event. It is a shock transmitted through financial markets, shipping networks, political alliances, and the daily routines of billions of people. This is where the pattern begins. Fear reshapes markets before reality does. Analysts suggest that if Iran ever decided to restrict tanker movement, it wouldn't begin with a sudden, dramatic blockade. Instead, it would start with ambiguity. Patrol boats shifting routes, military exercises near shipping lanes, a statement hinting at consequences for adversarial actions. At first, it would look like posturing. Then, the bill arrives. Insurance companies raise premiums overnight. Tanker captains slow their speeds. Shippers queue farther from the choke zone, waiting for clearer conditions. Oil futures spike as traders expect delays. And the world realizes that a waterway only 21 miles wide can move global prices in minutes. Here's the mechanism. Naval choke point disruptions create three simultaneous pressures: physical risk, financial contagion, and psychological escalation. Physical risk is straightforward. Mines, patrol boats, missile positions, or even drone activity can make tanker passage hazardous. Financial contagion emerges when insurers deem the route high risk, demanding enormous premiums to cover potential damage. Psychological escalation spreads when importers fear they may not receive enough supply for future months, prompting panic purchases that strain markets even further. Not disruption, amplification. Even a short slowdown at the strait can trigger cascading effects. Let me show you exactly how. Oil tankers typically take several days to cross from the Persian Gulf into open waters. A delay of 24 hours compounds as congestion builds, leading to multi-day bottlenecks. Meanwhile, refiners dependent on timely deliveries begin drawing down their storage reserves. Once those reserves fall below strategic thresholds, buyers rush into global markets to secure additional shipments, driving prices up further. Airlines hedge fuel. Shipping firms adjust routes. Households feel cost increases in everything tied to transportation, manufacturing, and heating. The danger wasn't what they saw, it was what they ignored, how closely their world had been stitched to a narrow maritime corridor. Some scenarios indicate that a partial interruption lasting only 1 week could send global oil prices skyrocketing past previous crisis levels. Others suggest a sustained closure could push certain import-dependent nations into emergency rationing, energy price caps, and industrial slowdowns. Analysts argue that Asia, particularly Japan, South Korea, and India, faces the highest exposure due to their reliance on Middle Eastern imports. Europe, too, would feel the impact despite diversified sources. The United States, while less dependent on Persian Gulf oil, would still confront global price disruptions that ripple through every sector of its economy. Not isolation, interconnection. But what would a true closure look like? And is it realistically possible? Some military experts argue that Iran could temporarily disrupt traffic through asymmetric tactics: fast attack vessels, anti-ship missiles, drones, and naval mines. Even a single incident, such as disabling a tanker in the narrowest passage, could force suspension of transit while navies respond. Others, however, emphasize that maintaining a full closure for an extended period would be extraordinarily difficult. The strait is monitored constantly by regional navies and global powers. A prolonged blockade could escalate into wider conflict, drawing in nations determined to reopen it. Analysts suggest that Iran understands this, which is precisely why the threat of closure is often more valuable than closure itself. Here's the trap. The world reacts to possibility, not certainty. Iran does not need to halt every tanker. It only needs to demonstrate credible capability: a mined corridor, a drone swarming exercise, a warning broadcast. And suddenly, energy importers must reassess their entire strategic posture. This is where the pattern of leverage emerges: subtle, ambiguous, but extraordinarily effective. Yet, while Iran holds influence over the strait, it is not the only player shaping outcomes. Gulf states depend heavily on exports and have expanded bypass pipelines to reduce reliance on Hormuz. The UAE constructed a pipeline to Fujairah, allowing some oil to be exported outside the strait. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline transports oil to the Red Sea, offering another partial alternative. But these routes handle only a fraction of total volume. Geography still dictates reality. The Strait of Hormuz remains irreplaceable. Meanwhile, global powers maintain constant naval presence in the region to deter escalation. The United States' Fifth Fleet, along with European and regional naval forces, patrols the corridor to ensure stability. But even with this presence, the psychological leverage remains. Naval protection can deter large-scale blockade attempts, but it cannot eliminate the market's fear of disruption. Prices move on signals, not assurances. In one scenario, tensions escalate gradually. A rescue operation, a disputed interception, a misinterpreted radar signal. Markets panic before diplomats intervene. Oil rises by $20, then $30, then $40 a barrel. Governments activate strategic petroleum reserves to calm public anxiety. Industries slow production to manage costs. Airlines raise ticket prices. Food distribution networks see increased expenses. The shock spreads like a ripple through every economic layer. In another scenario, a single incident, such as a damaged tanker or a brief firefight, forces shippers to halt operations temporarily. The strait becomes a waiting zone, with dozens of tankers anchored just outside the danger line. This creates a global energy bottleneck that no country can bypass. Countries with limited reserves face immediate stress. Some economies may slide toward recession, and public sentiment shifts rapidly as fuel prices impact daily life. At first, it looked like a contained confrontation. Then the bill arrived. A more severe scenario, though analysts debate its likelihood, imagines a sustained military standoff. Escalation between Iran and external powers leads to prolonged uncertainty. Insurance premiums explode. Shipping becomes prohibitively expensive. Nations scramble to secure alternative supplies from West Africa, the United States, or Latin America. But shipping times increase by weeks, and global refining systems struggle to adapt to different crude grades. Here's why this matters. The world's energy architecture is not interchangeable. Every tanker rerouted creates pressure somewhere else. And in the most extreme scenario, a regional conflict that spills into the strait, global energy markets experience shock unlike anything in modern history. Some economists argue that such an event could push oil above all previous records, ignite inflation worldwide, destabilize fragile economies, and trigger political crises across multiple regions. Not speculation, contingency. But even these scenarios reveal something deeper. The global economy no longer has simple vulnerabilities. Choke points like Hormuz are relics of an interconnected world that grew faster than its protective systems. Energy diversification is underway, but slowly. Renewables grow, but oil remains indispensable in shipping, aviation, and heavy industry. New trade routes develop, but none can replace the scale of Hormuz. This is the paradox of transition. The world is trying to escape its old dependencies while still living inside them. Here's what nobody tells you. The future of global stability may hinge on whether nations learn to manage not just energy supply, but the risk architecture surrounding that supply. Naval coalitions, diversified infrastructure, strategic reserves, diplomatic frameworks for crisis de-escalation. All of these may determine whether the next Hormuz scare becomes a brief spike or a global shockwave. And yet, the question remains, one the world has never fully answered. What happens when a choke point becomes both indispensable and indefensible in a world that cannot slow down long enough to redesign its foundations? Because if one nation has the ability to disrupt the heartbeat of global trade, even temporarily, the world must confront a truth it has avoided for decades. Power is not always held by those with the most resources, but by those who control the narrow places through which resources must pass.